You want to tell me what you're doing out here, sir?
Same thing I was doing 50 years ago.
Are you expecting someone?
No. But they're coming anyway.
Two cops pulled over an old biker for a broken light. Within minutes, a military convoy appeared, and the truth about who he really was left everyone speechless. It should have been a routine pullover. Two officers, one elderly biker, and a flickering taillight on a dusty Arizona highway. But nothing about what happened next would be routine. Walter Granger, 78 years old, sat upright on his faded 1962 Triumph Bonneville, his gloved hands steady on the handlebars. The road stretched quiet behind him, with the desert light cooling into long, sharp shadows. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't weaving. The only thing out of place was the faint pulse of a faulty taillight, barely noticeable but enough for the patrol unit cruising a few cars back to flip their lights on. Walter pulled over without hesitation, coasting onto the gravel shoulder just outside of Safford. His movements were calm, precise, like a man who'd spent years perfecting the art of not giving anyone a reason to raise their voice. Behind him, the police cruiser came to a slow stop. Officer Brenton stepped out first, thumb hooked on his belt, while his partner, Officer Leary, glanced cautiously toward the old man on the bike. Brenton raised a hand in a casual wave. "Evening, sir. You mind stepping off for a second?" Walter shut off the engine. The rumble died down. He removed his helmet with slow, deliberate hands, revealing a tanned, weathered face under a buzz of white hair. There was a deep scar just under his right eye and an even deeper quiet in his stare. "Something wrong?" he asked, voice dry but not unfriendly. "Just a quick stop. Taillights out. Figured you might not know," Brenton replied, maintaining a polite tone. Walter nodded. "Could be. This thing's older than you are." Brenton smiled. "Wouldn't be surprised." As Leary approached the rear of the motorcycle, he eyed the vintage plates, the military sticker, and the dusty duffel strapped to the back. His gaze lingered on the patch sewn into Walter's jacket, 101st Airborne. It was sun-bleached and frayed, but unmistakable. "You active duty before?" Leary asked. "Long time ago," Walter answered. "How long?" Walter didn't miss a beat. "Long enough?" There was a pause. Brenton took Walter's license, glanced it over, then walked back to the cruiser. Leary stayed, shifting awkwardly in the gravel. Walter looked toward the horizon. His expression hadn't changed, but there was a subtle tightening in his jaw. Something in him was listening, waiting. "Where are you headed?" Leary asked, trying to make conversation. "Veterans ride, about 6 miles out." "That right?" Leary asked. "Funny, don't see too many vets your age riding solo." Walter didn't answer that. Back at the cruiser, Brenton squinted at the screen. Walter's record was clean, no tickets, no trouble. But there was a small marker in the system. Not a red flag, just an old military security classification tag from decades ago. Brenton frowned, clicked around, but there wasn't much else. Just a name that popped up on an old declassified list. He looked up from the laptop. "Hey," he called to Leary, "stay with him a minute. I'm going to call this in just to make sure this guy's who he says he is." Leary raised an eyebrow. "You think he's lying?" Brenton shrugged. "Don't know yet. Something's not adding up." Back by the bike, Walter had already turned slightly, looking out into the desert again. Leary followed his eyes. "You hear something?" Walter gave a half smile. "Not yet." But about 3 miles out, a low tremor was already starting to hum across the dry ground, and what was coming would change the tone of that stop entirely. Brenton leaned against the side of the cruiser, phone pressed to his ear, the sun dipping lower by the minute. He wasn't sure what bug had crawled into his thoughts, but something about Walter's file didn't sit right. Not in a dangerous way, more like an itch at the back of his mind. The dispatcher on the other end answered. "Yeah, this is Officer Brenton, badge 4AE81, running a quick verification. Name's Walter Granger, born July 2nd, 1945. Says he's headed to a veterans event outside Safford. Can you check for any recent federal notes or flagged veteran records?" There was a pause. Some keys clicked. Then another pause, longer this time. "Hang on," the voice said. "That name's pinging something. Not flagged, but unusual clearance history. Classified stuff older than most of our digital records. Hold one." Britton tapped the roof of the cruiser and stared out the windshield at Walter, who stood quietly next to his bike, arms relaxed, weight shifted slightly to one side. Not nervous, not arrogant, just still. Back near the bike, Officer Leary was doing his best to keep conversation going, but Walter wasn't giving much up. He wasn't rude, just not chatty. You ever ride in parades? Memorial events? Walter smirked slightly. Crowds aren't really my thing. You local? Nope. Leary waited, hoping for more. It didn't come. Just visiting? Walter turned his head slowly. You always ask this many questions over a busted light? Leary chuckled, caught off guard. Fair enough, just trying to pass the time. Walter glanced up toward the road behind the cruiser. He could feel it. Not sound, not vibration, just something. The kind of thing you only notice when you've spent enough time in places where waiting too long can get you killed. Meanwhile, the radio on Brenton's hip crackled. Dispatch came back on. Okay, so Granger's legit, but here's where it gets strange. There's no criminal history, but there's a series of old notations linked to his name through a military back-channel database, cross-referenced with Cold War records and covert unit logs. Brenton frowned. Wait, like CIA? Not confirmed, but something. Look, this guy has old-school clearance. We're talking beyond top secret. Most of it was never digitized. Brenton lowered the phone. That wasn't normal. He hung up, walked slowly back to Leary. The two locked eyes briefly. Anything? Leary asked. Yeah, we need to keep him here a few more minutes. There's background we weren't expecting. Leary nodded, then turned back to Walter. Hey, sir, we appreciate your patience. My partner's just confirming some stuff. You mind sticking around a bit longer? Walter exhaled through his nose. Not in a rush. Mind if I ask, were you ever with Special Operations? Walter's lips pulled slightly. Why? Your name came up with some pretty high-level security tags. Walter looked at him for a long moment, then he said, That's not the kind of thing you forget, officer. That answer hung in the air. Just then a faint tremble passed under their feet. Leary blinked. You feel that? Before Brenton could reply, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon, about 2 miles south, low and thick, moving fast. Brenton turned, hand instinctively hovering near his belt. What the hell is that? Walter didn't turn around. He simply reached into his jacket, pulled out a small photo, and held it in his palm. Brenton's posture stiffened. Sir, I need you to... But Walter finally spoke with clarity. They're here. And before either officer could respond, the shape of large vehicles broke the edge of the horizon, followed by a rhythm they hadn't heard in years. Military tires gripping pavement, boots hitting dirt. It was coming fast, and all they could do now was wait. The desert wind picked up, kicking grit across the shoulder of the road. Officer Brenton stepped forward, shielding his eyes from the approaching haze. Behind it, the outline of armored trucks began to take shape. Large, squared silhouettes with desert camouflage and reinforced grills. They weren't local law enforcement, and they definitely weren't from any nearby base either. Tell me that's not what I think it is, Leary said, his voice low. Brenton didn't answer. His mouth had gone dry. Walter didn't move. He slipped the photo back into his jacket, then reached for his helmet. Not to put it on, but to rest it under one arm like it meant something. It was the kind of quiet gesture soldiers make when they know protocol better than words. 3 Humvees pulled up first, kicking up dust that fogged the edge of the road. Behind them came 2 heavy-duty transports, each lined with soldiers in full combat uniform, standing upright even as the vehicles rolled to a stop. The final vehicle in the convoy was smaller, black. Civilian grade, but still military. It pulled in directly behind the police cruiser. Brenton and Leary stepped back, their postures shifting from caution to confusion. They hadn't drawn weapons. This didn't feel like a threat. But it also wasn't normal. Not remotely. A door opened on the black vehicle. Out stepped a man in a sharply pressed uniform, his boots clicking against the asphalt as he approached. He moved like someone who didn't second-guess his decisions. His nameplate read Ramirez, and the silver bar on his chest left no doubt. Captain. He walked past the cruiser without so much as a glance at the officers. When he reached Walter, he stopped. They stared at each other in silence for a beat. Then the captain said, "Sir." Walter's reply was quiet, but it carried weight. "Eli." Leary's eyes flicked between them. "Wait, you two know each other?" Captain Ramirez turned slightly toward the officers. "Gentlemen, thank you for your time. We'll take it from here." Brenton took a cautious step forward. "Captain, with all due respect, can someone explain what the hell is going on?" Ramirez didn't raise his voice. "You're not in trouble, officers. You did your job. What you didn't know is that the man you pulled over is the reason I exist." Brenton blinked. "Come again?" Ramirez turned back to Walter. His expression softened just slightly. "My father told me the story my whole life. Laos, 72. Your unit wasn't supposed to be there, but you went in anyway. Extracted 24 prisoners, including him. He was 21, just a corporal. He said you walked through enemy fire like death had to ask your permission first." Walter didn't react, not in the usual way. Just a slow, steady breath. "I remember the ridge. Your father got shot in the leg. Told him to crawl or bleed out." Ramirez smiled faintly. He crawled. The silence between them felt personal, like it didn't belong to the road or the officers or even the desert around them. Then Ramirez looked over his shoulder and gave a quick signal. Within seconds, over 50 soldiers stepped off the transports and formed a clean, respectful line along the edge of the highway. Boots hit gravel with practiced precision. Not one of them said a word. Brenton stood frozen. "What is this?" Ramirez replied without turning. "A salute. He never asked for it. So, we're giving it to him." Walter adjusted the helmet under his arm. "This isn't necessary, Eli." "No, sir," Ramirez said. "It's overdue." But just as the air started to settle, one of the soldiers stepped forward, holding something tight in his arms, a folded flag. Walter's expression shifted just slightly, and the weight of the moment finally began to show in his eyes. The soldier who stepped forward was young, barely in his 20s, but he held the folded flag like it was made of glass. Every step he took was measured, deliberate. No one had told him to slow down, but somehow he understood that this moment wasn't about speed. Walter watched the boy approach. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. His jaw worked once, subtly, like he was keeping something down, something that had been waiting years to come up. The young soldier stopped directly in front of him, lowered his arms, and offered the flag with both hands. Walter didn't reach for it right away. Ramirez took a step forward and stood beside the young man. "Private Lawson requested to carry it himself," he said softly. "His grandfather was one of the POWs you pulled out in 72. He grew up hearing your name. Memorized it like scripture." Walter finally moved, taking the flag with steady hands. He held it close to his chest, eyes locked on the blue triangle, the white stars peeking out from beneath the folds. Officer Brenton couldn't speak. He didn't need to. Beside him, Leary had lowered his head slightly, his arms now crossed over his vest. Not in defense, but in respect. Both men had stumbled into something far bigger than a traffic stop. Ramirez looked over the line of soldiers. Present armed. In unison, over 50 rifles were raised, not to fire, not to threaten, but to stand in formal salute. The sound of the movement was clean, swift, unmistakable, sharp enough to slice through the heat hanging in the air, and in the center of it all, Walter Granger stood completely still, flag in hand, eyes staring into some distant place none of them could see. "You never wanted this," Ramirez said quietly, just to Walter. "But we did." Walter didn't reply. He kept his eyes forward. It wasn't about words anymore. It was about time, about silence, about all the things they never got to say to the men who didn't come back. Brenton found himself remembering his grandfather, who never talked about Korea, never said a word, just cleaned his tools in the garage and listened to old radio broadcasts. Maybe there was more behind those quiet afternoons than he'd ever known. A breeze rolled across the highway, kicking light sand along the asphalt, tugging gently at the corners of the flag in Walter's hands. Ramirez stepped back and gave another signal. From the lead transport, a soldier began playing a soft version of taps on a bugle. slow, aching, every note hanging in the air like it had nowhere else to go. Walter closed his eyes. He didn't see the soldiers anymore. He saw faces from decades ago, faces that never got older, faces he hadn't let himself remember in years. He whispered something. Ramirez heard it. Evans, Stewart, Juno, Randall. Names. Names no one else there would recognize, but Ramirez nodded. I looked them up, he said softly. We found their families. Some didn't even know the truth, but now they do, because of you. Walter's hands gripped the flag a little tighter, and for the first time that day, his voice cracked. I didn't save them all. Ramirez didn't hesitate. But you saved enough for us to be here. But while the scene grew heavier with emotion, the real shock hadn't landed yet. Not for the officers, not for the passers-by who had stopped on the opposite side of the road, recording the moment with quiet reverence. The next thing Walter did would bring all of it to a pause. Walter stepped forward just one pace and held the folded flag out, not to Captain Ramirez, but to the young private who had brought it to him. His hands didn't shake, but there was a weight behind the gesture that pressed against every soldier standing there. Keep it, Walter said. You'll understand why when you're older. Private Lawson hesitated, clearly stunned. He looked up at Ramirez, unsure if he should accept it. Ramirez gave him a quiet nod. The private took the flag with both hands as if the entire world had just shifted in his arms. And maybe, in a way, it had. Walter turned slightly, facing Ramirez now, finally letting his eyes meet the younger man's with more than a glance. You're Eli, he said. Your dad's name was Julian. Wore his boots 2 sizes too small because he didn't want to admit the Army issued him the wrong pair. Ramirez laughed under his breath, a soft, half-shocked sound. He told me that. Swore he never complained once, even when they bled. He didn't, Walter replied. He limped for 4 days, never said a word. A beat passed. Ramirez's face shifted. The crisp, commanding tone he carried moments ago faded just a little. I always wondered if the stories were real, he said. He told them like legends, but seeing you now, I believe every word. Walter looked off toward the desert again. I didn't save your father because of orders. I did it because the ones before him would have done the same for me. That's the only code that ever made sense out there. Brenton, standing a few feet away, cleared his throat. Captain, can I ask something? Ramirez turned. Of course. Why today? Why now? I mean, boss, you tracked him. You had this whole thing set up. Why here on the side of a highway? Ramirez looked at Walter before answering. Because he doesn't attend ceremonies, doesn't take awards. We tried 3 times to get him to D.C. He never answered. Someone spotted his name on a sign-up list for a charity ride. No press, no stage, just old bikes and older men riding in silence. That's how we knew this was the only way he'd let us thank him. Walter didn't deny it. He just stared forward like he'd already made peace with the attention being temporary. Ramirez continued. He didn't want a tribute, but we needed one. Leary spoke for the first time in minutes. So what happens now? Ramirez smiled. Nothing. We go back to base. He goes to his ride. The world spins the same as it did yesterday. He turned back to Walter. But some of us will sleep a little better tonight knowing we got to look him in the eye and say it. Walter's lips pressed into a thin line. He gave the faintest nod, not out of pride, but out of understanding. Ramirez took a step closer. Before we leave, I wanted to give you something. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a sealed tan envelope. No markings, no writing, just plain military issue. He handed it over. Walter took it slowly. He stared at the envelope for a moment before sliding it into the side of his saddlebag without opening it. Brenton and Leary watched in silence, unsure whether they had just witnessed a reunion, a ceremony, or something in between. But Ramirez knew exactly what it was. A moment repaid. But as the engines prepared to start again and soldiers began to return to their transports, No one expected what would come from the small crowd that had formed on the other side of the road, because someone in that group knew Walter too, and they had a story of their own to share. Just across the two-lane road, where a handful of onlookers had quietly gathered, a woman stepped forward. She looked to be in her early 60s, dressed in jeans and a pale yellow shirt, clutching her phone in one hand, but no longer recording. Her face was pale, her mouth slightly open like she was still catching up to what she'd just witnessed. Walter hadn't seen her yet. He was still facing Captain Ramirez, tightening the straps on his saddlebag, preparing to move on. "Mr. Granger," the woman called out. Not loud, just enough to carry over the hum of boots and low engines. He turned, eyes narrowing as he looked her way. "I think you knew my brother," she said, stepping off the shoulder and onto the highway, walking slowly across the faded yellow lines. "His name was Alan Forrester, Navy pilot, shot down in 71. Walter froze. She came closer, not rushing, not hesitant either. "They told us he died in the jungle, never found his body, just a letter. One sentence in a report. Presumed dead behind enemy lines. That's all we got." Brenton and Leary watched the moment unfold, standing completely still. The woman stopped in front of Walter, her eyes glassy but locked on his. "My father went to his grave thinking Alan died alone. But 4 years ago, a man from the VA visited my mother. Said someone had quietly made sure Alan got home. Not in body, but in story. He said that someone stayed behind to mark the trees so the retrieval unit could find the site. That man never left a name." Walter didn't blink. The woman reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of old paper. "He said whoever it was carved this into the bark." She handed it to Walter, scrawled on the paper in faded graphite. "Forrester. Position marked. Don't let him vanish." Walter took it in silence. Then, with eyes that finally betrayed emotion, he whispered, "We made a promise. Never leave one behind." The woman's hands trembled. "That was you?" He looked her straight in the eye. "It was all I could do. We didn't have time to pull him out, but I made sure someone would." She nodded once, then without hesitation wrapped her arms around him. The embrace wasn't dramatic. It wasn't forced. It was years of silence finally given shape. Walter didn't return the hug in full, but he didn't pull away either. His hand hovered near her back, resting just above her shoulder before he gently let go. Ramirez cleared his throat, giving the soldiers a final signal. "Company, attention!" The line of soldiers snapped back into formation. "Right face!" They turned, boots crunching the gravel. Then Ramirez called out, "Present arms!" One final salute, clean, unified, sharp. Walter turned to face them, slowly raising his right hand to his brow. No hesitation, no struggle. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, he saluted and held it. Private Lawson stepped forward again, flag in hand, now clutched tight against his chest. The other soldiers stood tall, many of them holding their salute a second longer than regulation. They weren't saluting rank. They weren't saluting orders. They were saluting him. The man who had never asked for recognition. The man who did the job and walked away. The sun dipped further behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the road. Some drivers who had pulled over were now standing outside their vehicles. Hats came off. Heads bowed. Nobody told them to do it. Nobody needed to. Walter lowered his hand. Ramirez nodded once. "Order arms." The rifles came down. A long silence followed. Nobody moved right away. But it wasn't over yet. Because Ramirez had one last thing to say, something personal, something his father had never stopped talking about, and it was time Walter finally heard it from someone else's mouth. The convoy hadn't moved yet. Captain Ramirez lingered by Walter's side, scanning the road and the crowd that had grown on the opposite shoulder. Civilians were still watching, some holding hands, some crying quietly, none of them fully grasping the depth of what they just witnessed, but all of them knowing it meant something important had just happened. Ramirez glanced at the ground for a second, then back up at Walter. "My father never stopped talking about you," he said. "Even when he couldn't remember his own birthday in those final months, he could remember your name." Walter shifted slightly but said nothing. He told me about a field, Ramirez continued, about how the extraction team was late. He said the jungle was burning behind you, and all you had was a busted radio, 2 loaded clips, and 23 men ready to give up. Walter's eyes didn't move. His voice, when it came, was low. We didn't give up. I know, Ramirez said. He told me. He said you made them crawl the last mile on their stomachs to stay hidden. He said you sang, sir, to keep them calm. Walter looked at him, eyebrow raised. That's classified. Ramirez let out a short laugh, his shoulders relaxing for the first time all day. I didn't believe it until he made me learn the lyric. Walter chuckled quietly. White Cliffs of Dover. That was the only song I knew all the words to. Ramirez stepped closer, lowering his voice. He told me something else, too, right before he passed. Walter tilted his head slightly. He said if I ever found you, I should say the exact words he never got to say. He wanted me to look you in the eye and say, you didn't just save my life, you gave me everything that came after it. For a long moment, Walter didn't move. The words hung between them, weightless and crushing at the same time. Brenton and Leary were still nearby. Neither spoke. Both had fallen quiet, letting the moment land as it needed to. Walter finally swallowed hard. Your dad ever tell you I almost left him behind? Ramirez blinked. No. He passed out. Bullet to the thigh, shock kicked in, we were under fire. I looked at my team and I hesitated. But you didn't leave him. Walter nodded slowly. No, but I thought about it. He glanced over at the soldiers, then the crowd, then back at Ramirez. You ever carry that weight, son? The ones you didn't save screamed louder than the ones you did. Ramirez didn't answer right away. Then carefully he said, I haven't lived through what you did, but I carry my own weight. I just try not to let it crush me. Walter took that in. That's good, he said. That's what keeps men upright. A horn blared in the distance. One of the transport drivers giving a short signal. Ramirez looked back, gave a 2-finger motion, and the convoy began to slowly reposition. Before leaving, Ramirez reached into his pocket one last time and pulled out something small, worn metal, curved. He handed it to Walter, a harmonica. Walter stared at it. He said you gave him yours. Said it kept him sane when things got bad. Walter took the harmonica carefully, turning it in his hand. I didn't think he'd keep it. He did. Had it till the day he died. Now it's yours again. Walter exhaled a slow breath and nodded once. Tell your mom he turned out all right. Ramirez smiled. I think she knows. The captain stepped back, gave a crisp salute, not military formality this time, something smaller, more human. Walter didn't salute back. He raised the harmonica instead. Ramirez got in the vehicle. The engines kicked on. Brenton walked over as the convoy began to roll out. Sir, I don't think I've ever witnessed anything like that. Walter shrugged, sliding the harmonica into his jacket pocket. Neither have I. Leary stepped up beside him. So what now? You riding to that benefit? Walter nodded. Yeah, I gotta show up. Someone's gotta talk the young ones out of riding with bald tires. Brenton laughed. You think they'll believe you? Nope, Walter said, "Bull." But I'll try anyway. But as Walter kicked his motorcycle to life and prepared to leave, the dash cam footage from the cruiser was already uploading to the department's server, and the story wasn't going to stay in Arizona for long. The cruiser's dash cam had captured everything, from the moment the police lights first blinked behind Walter's bike to the final salute and slow roll of the military convoy disappearing into the desert light. Back at the station, one of the overnight clerks reviewed the footage like he always did, just scanning for incident reports, double-checking timestamps. He stopped scrubbing the video just as the first Humvee appeared in frame. Then he hit rewind, then play, then pause. He didn't say a word, just pulled out his phone, trimmed a 47-second clip of the soldiers forming a line, and uploaded it to a private Facebook group for first responders across the Southwest. By morning, it was everywhere. News anchors were scrambling to verify it. The Arizona State Police put out a statement just before 9 a.m. confirming the event took place near Safford and that no violations or arrests were made. They called it a spontaneous moment of recognition. That's all they said. No names, no details. But people were already asking, who was the man on the motorcycle? The original clip was stripped, clipped, re-uploaded. TikTok edits added dramatic music. Instagram stories paired the salute with slow zoom-ins and hashtags like #RealHero and #DesertSalute. One video on YouTube had over 300,000 views by the second afternoon. The title read, "Cops pull over elderly man. Seconds later, 50 soldiers show up." Some thought it was staged. Some argued it had to be part of a campaign ad. Others swore it was AI. Until a young woman named Mariah Forrester posted a selfie at the scene. She was the sister of the downed pilot, and she shared her version of the story, down to the paper slip and the words carved into bark. Her post alone was shared nearly 40,000 times in 2 days. By the third day, Walter's name made it out. A local veteran confirmed it. Then another. Then a former Army mechanic posted a faded photo of his father with a man who looked just like Walter, only younger, thinner, standing in front of a jungle shack with mud on his face and fire in his eyes. Walter Granger had lived through decades without a whisper, and now strangers were stopping by the diner in Bowie just to leave a folded note on his table or pay for his coffee without saying a word. He didn't change his routine. He still showed up at the ride the next weekend, though he parked in the back this time. When someone asked if he'd seen the video, he just nodded once and said, "Heard about it." The waitress at the diner, a sharp-tongued woman in her 50s named Tess, gave him a look as she refilled his mug. "You gonna pretend you didn't go viral?" "I don't know what that means," he said without looking up. "It means people are crying over you in traffic on their lunch breaks, Walt." He sipped his coffee. "They'll get over it." Tess smirked. "Maybe, but you've got a letter from a senator and an invite to be on 2 morning shows. They both called here. I told them you don't own a cell phone." "That's true," he said. "And it's going to stay true." She dropped a white envelope in front of him. "This one's from the boy. The one with the flag. Lawson. Says thank you. Says you gave him something he didn't know he needed." Walter slid the envelope into his jacket without opening it. "Maybe I gave him something I didn't know I needed too." Later that day, as he wheeled the Bonneville out of the garage, he found a group of teens standing outside the fence, 5 of them with old helmets in hand, dusty boots, and hopeful expressions. One of them called out, "Mr. Granger, you the one from the video?" He paused, then walked the bike to the gate. "You here to ask questions?" he said. "No, sir," the kid replied. "We were just wondering, boss, if you ever show people how to fix old bikes like that." Walter studied them for a long second, then said, "I might if you know how to listen." But as the sun fell behind the hills again and the Bonneville rumbled to life, Walter wasn't thinking about views or headlines. He was thinking about the names he hadn't spoken in decades and how somehow they had finally been heard. It was quiet out by the cemetery near Wilcox. Not a single car in sight, just the sound of the wind brushing through rows of faded flags and plastic flowers, the occasional creak of an old gate, and Walter's slow steps along the gravel path. He carried no flag, no speech, and certainly no camera. Just a small brown paper bag from a roadside bakery and the harmonica Captain Ramirez had returned to him days earlier, tucked into his jacket pocket like it had never left. He stopped in front of a headstone worn with time. The name was simple: Evelyn Granger. Beneath it, the line read, "Wife, teacher, gave everything without asking for credit." Walter stood there for a while before speaking. "Didn't plan on visitors today," he murmured, but it seemed right. He set the bag down on the grass beside the grave. Inside it was a single blueberry scone, Evelyn's favorite. He never brought flowers, never saw the point. Evelyn used to joke that the only good flowers were the ones still growing. "I had a strange week," he said, adjusting his jacket. "Got pulled over. Tail light gave out." He chuckled once under his breath. "Would have just been a ticket, but the pass showed up. 50 soldiers. Whole convoy. Eli Ramirez. You remember Julian, don't you?" Boy with the soft eyes and the limp, his son's a captain now, said I saved his father's life. Maybe I did. Walter lowered himself slowly onto the bench nearby. The harmonica slid out from his jacket and rested in his lap. They gave me a flag, he said. I gave it away, felt like it belonged somewhere else, but they also gave me something I didn't expect, something I thought I was done with. He paused. Gratitude. The word came out slow, unfamiliar on his tongue. I used to think what we did back then should stay in the dark, that it was better that way, cleaner, safer, but maybe that was selfish. Maybe the stories should live, even if the men don't. He rubbed his thumb over the metal grooves of the harmonica. A kid came by the garage, wanted help fixing up a busted old Yamaha. Couldn't have been more than 16. Reminded me of Ricky, remember him? Always twisting wires the wrong way, but thinking he had it figured out. A breeze stirred the edge of the paper bag. Walter leaned forward and placed the harmonica gently on the flat stone of the grave. You never liked when I played this, he said. Said I was always just a half note off, but I think I'll leave it with you this time. He stood up slowly, stretching out his knees. I'm not going to D.C., he added. I know you'd say I should, that it'd be good for others, but I think I've done my part. Let someone else stand in front of the cameras. He looked out across the field, row after row of names. I'll keep writing, maybe teach a few kids something while I'm still standing. Let them figure out what kind of men they want to be. He started to turn, then stopped. I almost forgot, he said, reaching into his jacket again. This time he pulled out the tan envelope Ramirez had handed him, the one he hadn't opened. He held it in his hands for a long time, eyes scanning the crease in the flap. Then, without a word, he laid it down on the bench, left it there, unopened. For someone else, he muttered. Always is. He walked back to the Bonneville, threw his leg over the seat, and started the engine with a single kick. It caught rattling steady beneath him like it always had. As he rolled down the road and back onto the highway, the bag sat beside the grave, the harmonica resting against the stone. The letter remained untouched, waiting for a set of hands that hadn't arrived yet. But Walter didn't look back, because for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel like he owed anyone anything, not even the past. The next morning, Walter was back at the garage, seated on an overturned milk crate, sleeves rolled up, working the grease into his fingers like it was second nature. 3 kids were already there, one with a busted carburetor, another with a tank too rusted to bother saving, and one just watching, eyes wide, no bike at all. First lesson, Walter said, wiping his hands on a rag. Don't touch anything that smells like it's leaking and burning. That's not ambition, that's stupidity. The boys laughed. One of them made the mistake of calling him Sir. Walter gave him a look. Sir was the man who paid me to fix his truck and then never came back for it. Just call me Walt. By noon, more had shown up. A local teacher dropped off her nephew. A father from Tucson drove his teenage daughter up after seeing the viral clip, hoping she'd hear something different than the usual lectures from school or home. And Walter didn't mind. He still wouldn't talk about the war unless someone really asked, and even then, only pieces. But the kids didn't press. They wanted to know how to weld a gas tank without blowing up their eyebrows. They wanted to know if a 1978 Yamaha was worth saving. They wanted to build something with their hands. And Walter gave them space to do it. He never said it out loud, but something had shifted inside him. For years, he kept to himself. Not because he hated the world, but because the world had stopped making room for people who didn't ask for attention. People who didn't post. People who remembered things they couldn't say. But now, for the first time, the silence around him wasn't empty. It was full of new noise. Curious hands. Oil-streaked notebooks. The sound of life moving forward with his help. One evening, Brenton stopped by in his civilian clothes. He parked down the street and walked in holding a box of donuts like it was some kind of peace offering. Walter looked at him over his glasses. That's supposed to bribe me? Not bribe, Brenton said. Gratitude. Walter cracked a smile. You're about a week late. Better than never. They sat down on opposite crates, each taking a donut. The youngest kid in the group, maybe 12, stood nearby trying to figure out how to remove a bent clutch lever without breaking the whole mount. Brenton watched for a second, then leaned in. You know, I've seen a lot of people pull stunts to go viral. Flash mobs, burnouts, arguments, and none of them stuck. But your story, it's still being shared. Walter took a bite, chewed, and swallowed before saying, I didn't do anything. You did more than you think. Walter didn't respond right away. Then finally, if I had known that stop would turn into all this, I might have fixed the damn tail light. Brenton laughed. You think it would have stopped the captain? Walter gave it a second. Probably not. There was a pause, then Brenton asked, You think we deserve that kind of respect? Walter shook his head slowly. That salute? That wasn't for me. That was for the ones who didn't come home. I just carried their names a little further. Brenton looked around the garage. And now you're passing them on. Walter said nothing. He didn't have to. Because sometimes legacy isn't built on speeches or medals or marble statues. Sometimes it's built on the side of a highway with boots in the gravel and a story caught on camera. It's built in the hands of kids learning how to fix something broken. It's built in conversations between strangers, slow, steady, without drama. And for Walter Granger, that was enough. He didn't need a plaque. He had a garage. He had grease under his nails. He had peace. If this story moved you, take a moment to think about the people in your life who've carried more than they let on. And if you haven't yet, say thank you. You might be surprised what doors it opens. Subscribe for more stories that remind us what quiet heroism really looks like.